This is the first of two separate videos about constitutional compromises. When these 55 men eventually showed up in Philadelphia, because there were some that were there right away, others kind of trickled in. When they eventually arrived, there were three main sources of contention, three main debates. The first debate deals with Congress, representation in what would become Congress. Now, there was a Congress under the Articles of Confederation, and this legislative branch was viewed to be the most important, which is why Article 1, explaining Congress in the Constitution, is by far the longest. Now, it also explains why debate over the legislative branch took a month and a half to resolve. That's right, when it came to figuring out Congress, it took a month and a half of debate to iron it out. Now, Georgia and Pennsylvania were the only two states that had what we call a unicameral legislature, meaning in their Congress, they only had one house or one chamber. The rest already had what was called a bicameral legislature. They had two houses of Congress. So there was already a prevailing belief that the federal Congress should be bicameral. The issue becomes the number of representatives. Number of representatives, and then how voting should occur. The eventual solution comes to be known as the so-called Great Compromise. We give Roger Sherman of Connecticut the credit for it. Now, James Madison, the man who had a plan, he shows up and he wants what's called proportional representation in each chamber. Proportional meaning the number of representatives you get depends on how big your population is, the number of people that you have. He still has that attitude that if both are proportional, if the number of representatives you get is based on population, would lead to more opinions, and that would just lead to more checks on competing powers. So there would not be what's called a tyranny of the majority. Now, John Dickinson of Delaware proposed that the senators should be chosen by state governments to keep them involved in national affairs. All right, so the idea, Madison wants everything by population. Dickinson kind of counters, and he wants senators to be chosen by state governments. That will allow states to continue to be involved in national affairs. Roger Sherman of Connecticut, he gets credit because in mid-June, he was the first to propose what became the Great Compromise, but it was ultimately defeated. What we're going to see here are a fusion of two different ideas. VA plan, the Virginia plan. That's ultimately what Madison conceived of. New Jersey plan. This is the New Jersey plan because William Paterson of New Jersey was the first one to present the idea of keeping the basic legislative structure of the Articles of Confederation. Remember that under the Articles, there was one house of Congress, each got one vote. Now, Madison had actually refused to compromise on his issue. He didn't really want to give in to any other side. That was kind of one of the reasons why an opposition plan was formed and there was intense debate around the issue. Now, in our two chambers, the H of Reps, House of Representatives, that is going to be the chamber where the number of representatives you get is based on your population. So if you have more people in your state, you get more representatives. If you have less, you get less. But each state is guaranteed one. Each state gets one. This is the chamber, this is the House that is directly elected by the people. As such, it represents the people. Because this is the chamber that's directly elected by the people, elections occur every 2 years. The idea behind this is if you serve a 2-year term, you continually have to answer to the people. So if a representative isn't getting the job done, they'll simply be voted out. Part of the Great Compromise was the House of Representatives was given the so-called power of the purse, meaning that any bills concerning money and spending had to originate in the House. But Madison really saw this as little consequence. He kind of felt he had lost on this debate. So we have the House of Representatives. And then we have the SEN. That's the Senate. The Senate is where we have equal representation. Each state, no matter how big or how small, gets 2. That's all. 2 senators. So yes, it is possible, and there are some states today that have 2 senators but only 1 representative. Initially, the Senate was designed to represent the states. And that's why senators, up until the 17th Amendment was ratified, senators were chosen by state governments and state legislatures. This was not only to give the states a say in the national government, but it was also designed to shield senators from popular opinion, or the will of the people, as it were, the whim of the people. So the states pick them, they're shielded from the people, and they serve 6-year terms. So remember, a month and a half. It took a month and a half to figure out this compromise over Congress. So that's compromise number 1. Compromise number 2 deals with figuring out how to count the population of each state. Now there's this phrase, other persons. Other persons definitely was something that everyone understood to mean slaves. Is this a debate over slavery as such? Not exactly. It's a debate over how to count slaves as part of the population. That's what it's all about, because each state is going to get 1 representative for every 30,000 inhabitants. Representation in the House of Representatives. Eventually, a 3/5 rule was adopted. That's where 3/5 compromise comes from. Now, one of the delegates actually proposed eliminating it because he felt that it would give the South an advantage in terms of population count, because we're already at a point where there are many more slaves in the American South than in the North. His proposal was defeated 10-1. Now, these ideas here are important to understand in the context of time. There was kind of a general consensus that the delegates could not engage in nation building at the same time as ending slavery. Were there delegates who owned slaves? Certainly. Were there delegates who wanted to end slavery? 100%. But the general feeling was we have to build a nation first. Ending slavery, we'll take care of that later, either down the road or the next generation. So it was tabled for a later date. And this was purely political. If the proposal was made that slavery would be eliminated in this new nation, every single Southern delegate would have stood up and walked out, and we wouldn't have the United States. So that's the context of the so-called 3/5 compromise. Now the question becomes, why 3/5? Why is it that the decision was made that for every 5 slaves in a state, 3 would count in terms of the population? Now, this actually goes back to the early 1780s when we were still under the Articles of Confederation. So James Madison tried to propose a method by which there could be a general fund for the national government. It was a general fund because national taxation was illegal. Each state would have to contribute a specific dollar amount based on their property taxes. So his initial thought was property taxes. But everyone assumed that each state would undervalue its properties, so they'd pay less. So that was kind of unreliable. Now, Madison proposed payment according to population. And he wanted 2 slaves to count as 1 person. So it would have been 2 slaves would be 1 person, so 50%. He did this because a large portion of Southern wealth came from slave labor. Northern representatives countered by recommending 75%. They wanted 3/4 of slaves counted because that meant the South would have to pay more money. So when faced with 50%, 75%, Madison did the math and he came up with 3/5 as a compromise. And that 3/5 was accepted. So that's where the fraction of 3/5 historically comes from, where 3/5 of slaves would be counted for the purpose of states contributing to a general fund. And it was 3/5 that did remain in place for the purpose of counting slaves as part of the state population when it came to representation in the House. It was purely a political compromise.